The 2024-25 season has all but came to an end, and this very much feels like a year where football won. All across Europe's top leagues there was a number of incidences where clubs who were not expected to be lifting silverware this year done just that. And today I want to have a look at some of those examples. So let's start in England with the League Cup. We'll pick up from the quarter final, the first tie of which saw Spurs host Manchester United. Both clubs could have been really doing with going far in this competition. However, in this game, after 3 shocking bits of defending, Spurs would see themselves 3-0 up after just 55 minutes, Solanke bagging 2 and Kulusevski 1, before 2 more defensive mistakes from Fraser Forster at Spurs' end this time gave United 2 goals back by the 70th minute, Joshua Zirkzee and Amad Diallo scoring them. And then in another defensive mistake, United would go 4-2 down as Heung-min Son scored directly from a corner.
Y'all are trash. And I mean this from the bottom of my heart.
That was in the 88th minute. United would claw 1 back in the 4th minute of injury time through a Johnny Evans header. However, it wasn't enough and Spurs won that tie 4-3 to send them through to the semi-finals. The next quarter-final tie would see Southampton host Liverpool. One of the worst Premier League sides we've ever seen against what would be the eventual champions, seeing this game be pretty routine for Liverpool.
Easy!
Darwin Núñez and Harvey Elliott both scored in the first half. Southampton would claw a very good goal back in the second half through Cameron Archer, but it wasn't enough and Liverpool would see themselves through to the semi-finals as well. A third quarter-final game seen Arsenal host Crystal Palace. Only 4 minutes into the game, Crystal Palace would see themselves go 1-0 up from a goal from Jean-Philippe Mateta, and they would go in at half-time still 1-0 up. Things weren't looking good for Arsenal, but they certainly turned it on in the second half. A second half hat-trick from Gabriel Jesus would see Arsenal go 3-1 up.
I'm back.
Before former Arsenal striker Eddie Nketiah would give Palace a goal back to make it 3-2 with just 5 minutes to go. However, this also wasn't enough and Arsenal seen themselves be the third team through to the semi-finals. And our last quarter-final match seen Newcastle host Brentford. This would also be a routine win for Newcastle.
All too easy.
Sandro Tonali would score 2 goals in the first half. Fabian Schär would pick up a third in the second half. And in injury time, Brentford would get a consolation goal back through Visa. So that set us up for the semi-finals. 2 legs for each tie. Spurs would play Liverpool and Arsenal would play Newcastle. Spurs and Newcastle were on long trophy droughts and pressure was mounting on Arsenal to win something, whilst Liverpool were in red hot form. The first semi-final would see Spurs host Liverpool. Liverpool looked the more likely to score and had some of the better chances, but Spurs actually defended well for once, and with 5 minutes to go, Lucas Bergvall scored to give Spurs a lead to take to Anfield. So 1-0 up on aggregate, Spurs going to Anfield, all they had to do was avoid losing to go into the final and get a chance at a trophy. So did Spurs do that? No, they lost 4-0.
Shocked. Well, not that shocked.
Cody Gakpo would level things for Liverpool in the 34th minute. Spurs goalkeeper Kinski would bring down Núñez in the box, and Salah would score the penalty that resulted from it just after half-time. Then with 15 minutes to go, Dominic Szoboszlai would make it 3-1 to put the game to bed. That was it over, Liverpool were in the final. 5 minutes later in the 80th minute, Van Dijk would score from a corner to make it 4, just to laugh at Tottenham. So Liverpool were our first finalists. Then in the other semi-final, the first leg would see Arsenal host Newcastle in London. Again, both teams could really be doing with this trophy. Arsenal started the game well in the first leg and had some good chances. Martinelli even hit the post. But in a disaster for Arsenal, Newcastle would score first, Alexander Isak in the first half. And then in the second half, an even bigger disaster for Arsenal as Anthony Gordon would score a rebound just 6 minutes into the second half to make it 2-0 to Newcastle, which would be the final score of the first leg. Arsenal weren't out yet though, they had the second leg to take place in Newcastle. Arsenal had it all to do and they had a lot to do, but they had to believe, and they did believe, that they could come back from this. They weren't going to let another chance at a trophy slip away. Nah, never mind, Arsenal lost 2-0 again. To be honest, Arsenal got battered throughout this game. Just 20 minutes in, Jacob Murphy would score to make it 3-0 on aggregate. and then an absolute horrid mistake at the back from David Raya would give Anthony Gordon a second goal to make it 4-0 to Newcastle, and Arsenal were dumped out of the League Cup. And this meant the final was set, Liverpool versus Newcastle, one game at Wembley. Going into this, Liverpool would have been the favourites, not huge favourites, but favourites nonetheless. They were in good form and were obviously top of the league. However, Newcastle very much wanted this more. The first half of this final was largely uneventful, however in stoppage time, 6'5" local Newcastle lad Dan Burn would score a header from a corner to give Newcastle the advantage to take into half time. And then in the 52nd minute, having already had a goal ruled out for offside just minutes before, Alexander Isak would score to make it 2-0 to Newcastle. Liverpool done all they could to try and come back into the game, but it would take until the 94th minute before Chiesa would score, and it ultimately wasn't enough. The game ended 2-1 to Newcastle, and they won the League Cup and their first trophy in 70 years. It was also a first major trophy for manager Eddie Howe, and it really felt as if this was coming for Newcastle. They'd been on a steady incline since they took over, and I doubt this is going to be the last trophy that Newcastle win in the foreseeable future. For our second competition, we go over to the Netherlands for the KNVB Cup. Starting with the last eight, our first quarter final saw Heracles beat FC Utrecht 2-0 at home to advance to the semi-final. In the second quarter final, AZ Alkmaar would advance past second tier side Quick Boys 3-1 at home. The third quarter final was the big one as PSV had advanced 2-0 past Feyenoord. This left them the favourites to win the cup as Ajax had already been knocked out in the previous round. And that's because the final quarter final seen Go Ahead Eagles advance past Nordvik 3-1 after two Nordvik own goals. The first semi-final seen Heracles host AZ Alkmaar. Alkmaar would take an early lead after just 12 minutes before Heracles equalised in the 17th minute, which would only last until the 28th minute when Alkmaar took the lead again. The game would remain 2-1 from this point until the 80th minute despite Alkmaar hitting the post, but a mistake at the back would see Heracles grab an equaliser again. Heartbreakingly for Heracles, the game would end with them losing on penalties, and this meant that AZ Alkmaar were our first team in the final. The second semi-final seen PSV host Go Ahead Eagles. PSV would have been the favourites for this game. However, a corner to the back post and a counter-attack after a penalty claim seen Go Ahead Eagles go 2-0 up within the first 30 minutes. And at half-time it would remain 2-0. PSV would claw one back after a second penalty claim was agreed by the ref for a handball, which Luc de Jong would score, but it wasn't enough and the eventual title winners in the Netherlands were knocked out by Go Ahead Eagles, which meant the final would see four-time cup winners AZ Alkmaar against Go Ahead Eagles, who haven't won a trophy since 1933. The first half was relatively uneventful. AZ had the bulk of the chances, however neither side could find a breakthrough, and at half-time the score was 0-0. In the 50th minute, AZ Alkmaar would be awarded a penalty after a high challenge, which would be saved. However, the penalty would be retaken as the goalkeeper was deemed to have come off his line too early, and Spurs Academy product Troy Parrott would score on the second time of asking. For the remainder of the game, each team would have some decent chances, but Go Ahead Eagles would defend well and keep believing. Their chance came in the final minute of injury time as a ridiculous AZ Alkmaar handball gave a penalty to the Eagles, which they would score. Extra time came next. Both teams again had chances but neither could score, which meant the game would be decided on penalties. Not surprising, seeing as both the goals had been penalties. However, some goalkeeping heroics from Go Ahead Eagles goalkeeper De Busser saving AZ Alkmaar's third and fourth penalties would see the Eagles win this game and win their first trophy for 91 years. Moving on to Italy now for the Coppa Italia. Once again, we'll start with the last eight. The first quarter final would see AC Milan advance past Roma 3-1. Tammy Abraham would score twice against his parent club, before Dovbyk would get a goal back for Roma and João Felix would score on his debut to put AC Milan in the semi-final. The second quarter final would see Inter Milan advance past Lazio 2-0 thanks to a wonder volley from Arnautovic and a penalty from Halanoglu. The third quarter final didn't go to plan. Juventus would be knocked out at home on penalties by an Empoli side that would eventually go on to be relegated. And the last quarter-final would see Bologna edge 1-0 past Atalanta away from home in a very good result for them. That meant the semi-finals were set, and the first one would be a two-leg Milan derby, Inter being the big favourites on paper. The first leg started slow, it would be goalless at half-time. Just 2 minutes into the second half, Tammy Abraham would put AC in front, however in the 67th minute Halanoglu would put Inter Milan level, and the first leg would end 1 each.
Hey, that's pretty good.
Going into the second leg, however, it was not at all what was expected. AC Milan would make the most of their chances and destroyed Inter 3-0. Luka Jovic came back from the dead to score 2 goals, and Reinders scored as well to make light work of Inter Milan, and AC were now favourites for the final. The second semi-final would be between Empoli and Bologna and would start with Empoli at home. They did not have such a good time. Bologna would take 2 goals in the first half and a third just after half-time to win the first leg 3-0. It looked like too much for Empoli, and it unfortunately was. The second leg would see Bologna win 5-1 on aggregate, 2-1 on the night.
Better luck next time, buddy.
And the final was set, AC Milan against Bologna. The final started and both teams had some good chances in the first half, although Milan's were much better chances. However, unfortunately for Milan, Bologna goalkeeper Lukas Skrupski wasn't for letting anything get past him. So at half-time the score was 0-0 and things started to get tense for Milan. They'd been poor all year and really needed this cup to save what was a very poor season. However, in the 53rd minute, Bologna would find a breakthrough to go a goal in front. AC didn't manage to fashion much in the way of chances after that, meaning Bologna would win the Coppa Italia and their first trophy for 51 years. Moving back to England now for the FA Cup. The quarter-finals would start easily as Palace would make light work of Fulham, winning 3-0 in their stadium, and they would advance to a semi-final against Aston Villa, who moved past Preston 3-0, and another routine easy win. The next quarter-final would see it take penalties to separate Forest and Brighton, but Forest would be the ones that moved to a semi. And lastly, Manchester City would come back against Bournemouth away from home to make it to a semi-final. So, on to Wembley now, and our first semi-final would see Palace and Villa. Villa started well, but a mistake at the back would result in Palace's star man, Eberechi Eze, scoring a screamer for the second round in a row, after banging one in against Fulham. Into the second half, and Palace would win a penalty, which Mateta would miss. No matter though, as just before the hour mark, Ismaila Sarr would score another long-range goal to make it 2-0 to Palace. Villa would do all they could to try and come back, but would ultimately fail, and just before the end of the game, Ismaila Sarr would score a second. The game would end 3-0 to Palace, and they were into the final.
Yeah, baby! That's what I've been waiting for. That's what it's all about.
The second semi-final would see high-flying Nottingham Forest against struggling Manchester City. Forest were in form, City were out of form. This was the game that Forest would prove there was a reason for their recent success. That form and that belief would take them to a final and a chance of winning a trophy. And that belief would last a full 2 minutes before Rico Lewis put Manchester City in front from a strike outside the box. Forest would do all they could to try and come back in, but they could not break City down to get a goal. And Yusuke Vardiol would score from a corner just into the second half. Unfortunately, the game would end 2-0 for Forest and they were out. Huge favourites Manchester City against Crystal Palace. City were going for the 8th FA Cup of their history, and Palace were going for their first ever trophy. City would have all the chances early on, but in the 16th minute, once again, Palace's hero Eberechi Eze would score on the counter from a perfect Daniel Munoz cross. City would really start to turn the pressure on, and apparently there was a handball in the 26th minute. I mean, I didn't see it, I don't know about you guys. However, 33 minutes in, it would all go wrong for Palace, as Mitchell would hack down Silva and give Manchester City a penalty. But today, football was going to win, as Dean Henderson, who totally should still be on the park, saved the penalty.
What is going on here?
Half-time would come, still 1-0 to Palace. City would do all they could in the second half, but Palace would hold out to win the FA Cup and the first trophy in the club's history. Putting them into Europe next year, and keep an eye on Selhurst Park over the summer. I'm sure there will be a statue of Eberechi Eze outside of it before the start of next season. Okay, next let's move to Germany for the DFB Pokal. Once again we'll start with the last 8, but I should mention that the competition favourites Bayern Munich were knocked out in the previous round, and Borussia Dortmund weren't even present at that. Our first quarter-final seen third-tier side Arminia Bielefeld take on Werder Bremen. After being caught out at the back, Marius Wörl would score an absolute screamer to put Arminia in front 35 minutes in, and then in the 41st minute a comical own goal would make it 2-0. 56 minutes on the clock and Bremen would get one back through, get ready for it, Oliver Burke.
How? How? How?
I don't know.
It wasn't enough though, and Arminia are our first team in the semi-final. Bayer Leverkusen would get past FC Köln 3-2 after doing standard Bayer Leverkusen antics, grabbing a 96-minute equaliser to make it 2 each, going into extra time and winning thanks to a Victor Boniface goal. Our third game would see Stuttgart get past Augsburg thanks to a Dennis Undav goal. They would win that 1-0. And Leipzig would get past Wolfsburg, also winning 1-0 thanks to a Benjamin Šeško penalty. So our first semi-final would see third tier Arminia go against previous season's league champions Bayer Leverkusen. Leverkusen were enormous favourites in this tie, and they would start well. Just 17 minutes in, they'd go 1-0 up from a corner, Jonathan Tah scoring. However, only a few minutes later, Arminia would equalise despite calls for a foul in the build-up to the goal. And then amazingly, somehow, just before half-time, Arminia would go 2-1 up from a set-piece.
What is going on here?
But even more amazingly, they managed to prevent Leverkusen doing typical Leverkusen things and didn't concede in the second half despite 6 minutes of injury time to make it to the final. And our second semi-final was a weird one. It would see Stuttgart take on Leipzig. Leipzig were the much better team in this game, having 2/3 of the possession and more than twice the attempts on goal that Stuttgart had. But a wonder volley 6 minutes in from Angelino Stiller, goalkeeper Alexander Nobel's absolute refusal to concede, and some brilliant build-up play for the second goal had Stuttgart in a good position. Benjamin Šeško would score again to get one back for Leipzig to make it 2-1, but Stuttgart would score again 10 minutes later to end the game 3-1 and move on to the final. So, the final was set. Stuttgart, who hadn't won a trophy since 2007, or a third-tier Arminia side. Either way, an underdog was winning this today. And unfortunately for Arminia, Stuttgart did not come to play nice. 3-0 up before even 30 minutes had been played, and then a fourth goal in the 66th minute. It was just too much for Arminia. They would claw 2 goals back in the 82nd and 85th minutes, but it was Stuttgart's day and they claimed the DFB Pokal for 2025. And now let's finish things off with the Europa League. Now there's a lot to cover here, so let's go through the quarter-finals quickly. Spurs drew at home with Frankfurt in the first quarter-final but managed the return leg in Germany very well, winning 1-0 to make the semi-finals. Lazio would fall to Bodo Glimt on penalties after 2 legs. Bilbao proved to be too much for Rangers in the second leg as they advanced to the semi-finals. And Manchester United couldn't decide if they were absolutely amazing or completely crap, but somehow managed to sneak past Lyon to make it into the semi-final. So our first semi-final would see Bodo Glimt play Spurs in London. Unfortunately for them, a misunderstanding of the rules seen Bodo have 3 first-team players suspended, and Spurs would prove to be too much. Going in front from literally the first minute, a second in the 34th and a penalty converted in the 61st to make it 3-0. Bodo would get one back, meaning the tie wasn't dead at 3-1 heading into the second leg. But Spurs would be too much and would win that 2-0 to advance to the final 5-1 on aggregate.
All too easy.
The other semi-final would see Manchester United go to Bilbao. Bilbao were probably favourites to win this, seeing as the final was in their stadium. It felt like a tournament they were desperate to win, and of course United had been terrible all year. However, 30 minutes on the clock, United would go in front thanks to a Casemiro goal. 5 minutes later, Bilbao would go down to 10 men, and then a brace from Bruno Fernandes before half-time would give United a 3-0 lead, and that's how the first leg would end. Bilbao would have a lot to do to come back from this in Manchester, and they would take the lead in Manchester after 31 minutes to make it 3-1, so the tie was very much still alive, although it was a long shot. However, Bilbao would completely crumble and capitulate. United would score 4 goals in the second half to put this game well to bed, 7-1 on aggregate. So that means the final was set 16th against 17th in the Premier League, and one was about to win a European Cup. And I think we can all agree that this was one of the worst European finals ever. Both these teams are terrible, so it should surprise no one really that the game was as it went. United started the game better, but Spurs would score from either Brennan Johnson or Luke Shaw, and no one really knows for sure. It was a terrible goal nonetheless. And that's it. Spurs won 1-0, pretty much nothing else happened in this final. United were terrible, Spurs were slightly less terrible, but despite that, a 17-year wait for a trophy was over, and Spurs had won the Europa League. So that's going to cover it for this video, guys. I hope everyone enjoyed, and thanks to everyone who's made it this far into the video. I really enjoyed researching this one and getting to look back at all these different games. And it has been a really good year for just general fans of football, getting to see so many different teams who have not had any recent success get some success. Hopefully that continues into next year. But thanks again to everyone who's watched this video. If you enjoy my content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me out. And I'll see everyone in the next video.